At my brother's luxury wedding, I found my assigned seat outside the grand ballroom pushed against a service hallway wall right next to the kitchen trash cans. He looked at me in my simple dress smirked and told me I simply did not count enough to take a seat from someone who actually mattered. I did not scream or cry. I just set my gift envelope down on that sticky plastic table, smiled, and walked away. Minutes later, the entire ballroom erupted in panic and my brother went dead pale. If you have ever been treated like garbage by the people who share your blood, stay with me. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments and subscribe if you believe in instant karma. My name is Riley. I am 27 years old, and until that evening, I thought I had seen the absolute worst my family had to offer. The Waldorf Astoria in Chicago was buzzing with the kind of extravagant energy that costs an absolute fortune to manufacture. I walked through the gilded lobby wearing an understated navy dress, holding a crisp white envelope in my hand. Inside the grand ballroom, massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hundreds of guests dressed in haute couture. My brother Tyler, who had just turned 30, was celebrating his marriage to Jasmine. Jasmine was a 28-year-old African-American woman whose fierce obsession with high society and flawless public image perfectly matched his own. Tyler was an investment broker, an arrogant man who prided himself on wearing custom-tailored suits and driving imported sports cars. Our parents, Richard and Patricia, were floating around the room, overflowing with pride for their golden boy. They had spent my entire life dismissing my existence, making it abundantly clear that my presence was an unfortunate footnote to Tyler's glorious legacy. When I approached the host stand to find my table number, the event coordinator frowned. She scrolled down her digital tablet, her manicured finger stopping at the very bottom of the guest list. She gave me a look of deep pity, then asked me to follow her. We did not walk into the breathtaking ballroom where premium champagne was flowing and a live string quartet was playing. Instead, she led me through a heavy set of swinging wooden doors and straight into the service hallway. The air instantly shifted from the scent of expensive perfume and fresh floral arrangements to the sour odor of discarded food and industrial cleaning supplies. Stressed waitstaff rushed past me, carrying heavy trays of appetizers, shouting orders over the clatter of silverware. Right next to a row of massive gray trash cans sat a cheap, wobbly plastic folding table. There was no silk tablecloth. There was no elegant floral centerpiece. Just a single paper seating card that read "Riley" printed in plain black ink. I stood there letting the reality of the brutal situation wash over me. My own parents and my brother had deliberately planned this. They had invited me to the wedding of the decade just to seat me beside the garbage. They wanted to make sure I understood exactly where I stood in their strict family hierarchy. To them, I was just a socially inept geek, an entry-level computer worker who spent her days hiding behind screens. They thought my simple clothes and quiet demeanor meant I was broke and entirely irrelevant. They had no idea that my job as a cybersecurity and data compliance investigator was merely a cover, or that I was actually the founder and CEO of Vanguard Compliance, one of the most ruthless corporate auditing firms in the country. Before I could even fully process the extent of their cruelty, the heavy swinging doors burst open. Tyler and Jasmine stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the service hallway, trying to escape the crowded ballroom for a private photo opportunity. Jasmine looked absolutely stunning in a custom designer gown dripping in diamonds, though my investigator instincts already knew exactly how those diamonds had been paid for. When she spotted me standing next to the trash cans, she stopped posing and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She adjusted her heavy gown, whispering something in Tyler's ear that made him chuckle loudly. Tyler walked over to me, his chest puffed out with arrogant satisfaction. He looked me up and down, taking in my plain navy dress, and then looked pointedly at the plastic table. "Guess you do not count," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. We needed the ballroom seats for people who actually matter, not entry-level computer geeks. Jasmine stepped up beside him, crossing her arms with a self-satisfied smirk. "We simply could not risk you ruining the aesthetic," she added, her tone incredibly sweet, but laced with pure venom. "My family flew in from Atlanta and they expect a certain caliber of guests. We could not have you bringing down the tone of the evening. My parents had always taught Tyler that he was inherently superior, and Jasmine was fully complicit in his bullying. They looked at me with such absolute disdain, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to cause a scene so they could call hotel security and label me the unstable, jealous sister. But I did not give them that satisfaction. I did not cry. I did not argue. I felt an overwhelming sense of cold calm wash over me because I knew exactly what was inside the white envelope I was holding. I knew that while they were busy mocking my plain clothes and my supposed lack of status, their entire world was resting on a fragile house of cards that I was about to blow down. I looked Tyler dead in the eyes, my expression completely neutral and unbothered. I reached out and calmly placed the white gift envelope right in the center of that sticky plastic table. I smiled politely at both of them, refusing to let them see a single ounce of hurt. "Enjoy the rest of your lives," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. I turned my back on their confused faces, pushed open the exit doors, and walked out into the cool evening air without a single backward glance. I knew I did not need to stay to watch the fireworks. The trap was already set, and the countdown to their destruction had just begun. The crisp evening air hit my face as I walked across the hotel parking lot toward my car. I climbed into the driver's seat, the heavy door shutting with a solid thud that blocked out the distant sounds of the city. I did not waste a single second. I pulled my personal smartphone from my clutch, opened my contacts list, and methodically blocked my mother, my father, Tyler, and Jasmine. I deleted their text threads and silenced all incoming notifications from any unsaved numbers. They were dead to me now, ghosts from a past I was officially leaving behind. Then I reached into the hidden compartment of my center console and retrieved my secondary device. It was a heavily encrypted military-grade smartphone that only 3 other people in the world had the clearance to call. The screen illuminated the dark interior of my car, casting a faint blue glow over my face. I opened my proprietary monitoring dashboard, a customized application my firm used to track high-level financial anomalies in real time. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic precision. I felt no guilt, no remorse, and no hesitation. I had spent years watching my parents fund Tyler's extravagant lifestyle while treating me like an unwanted financial burden. They had always assumed I was oblivious to their financial maneuvering. They were horribly mistaken. I tapped a few commands into the encrypted interface, accessing the secure portal that linked directly to the federal fraud alert system I had configured earlier that week. I leaned back against the leather headrest, my eyes glued to the tracking dashboard. The trap was armed. Now all I had to do was wait for them to pull the trigger. Inside the grand ballroom, completely ignorant of the impending disaster, my parents were undoubtedly mingling with high society guests, clinking crystal champagne flutes, and boasting about Tyler's incredible success. I knew the exact schedule of the evening down to the minute. At 5:15, the wedding planner, a notoriously strict woman named Cynthia, was scheduled to approach my parents for the final payment. The Waldorf Astoria did not play games with their billing, especially for an event of this magnitude. The remaining balance for the premium catering, the open bar, and the venue rental was exactly $150,000. The contract clearly stipulated that this final amount had to be authorized and processed before the kitchen staff would begin plating the main course for the 300 distinguished guests. I watched the digital clock on my encrypted phone tick closer to the deadline. 5:14, 5:15. A bright red notification suddenly flashed across my screen. It was a real-time alert from the Credit Monitoring Bureau. A massive transaction attempt had just been initiated under my Social Security number. I smiled, watching the data stream across the encrypted screen. My mother, Patricia, had just handed over her shiny premium credit card to Cynthia. I could picture the scene perfectly. My mother standing tall, wearing her expensive designer gown, casually handing over the card with a smug, self-satisfied expression, fully believing she had outsmarted the system. She thought she was using a limitless line of credit. She had absolutely no idea she had just walked straight into a federal fraud tripwire. Through my secure network connection, I received the instantaneous server response. Transaction declined. Fraud alert triggered. Inside the venue, Cynthia swiped the premium card through her portable payment terminal. The machine emitted a sharp negative beep. My mother probably laughed it off at first, waving her hand dismissively and claiming it was just a simple bank error or a security hold due to the unusually large amount. She would have told Cynthia to run the card again, her tone dripping with that familiar condescending impatience she always used when dealing with service workers. Cynthia swiped the card a second time. The terminal beeped again, flashing a harsh red error code. The card was completely frozen. I saw the secondary alert hit my phone as my father Richard stepped in to rescue his wife from the mounting embarrassment. I watched the system log his attempt. He handed over his own top-tier corporate credit card, offering a tight, apologetic smile to the planner while silently cursing the bank. Cynthia processed Richard's card. The system processed the request cross, referenced the newly activated federal fraud lock associated with their shared accounts, and immediately killed the transaction. Declined. Account frozen. The digital logs on my screen painted a vivid picture of their rapid descent into panic. Two different premium cards, both hopelessly locked out. The smug confidence that had defined my parents my entire life was evaporating in real time, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were standing in front of 300 elite guests with absolutely zero purchasing power. The situation in the ballroom was escalating rapidly. Cynthia, maintaining her professional composure but bound by the strict policies of the luxury hotel, stepped closer to my parents. I knew exactly what she was telling them. She politely but firmly demanded a working payment method immediately. She informed Richard and Patricia that the kitchen staff had strict orders. They would halt all operations, turn off the stoves, and refuse to serve a single plate of the main course until the $150,000 balance was successfully processed. The clock was ticking. The guests were taking their seats expecting a lavish 5-course meal, completely unaware that the hosts were entirely broke. My parents were backed into a corner, sweating under the crystal chandeliers, frantically trying to reach a bank representative who would only deliver devastating news. The first domino had officially fallen, and the catastrophic chain reaction was now completely unstoppable. I sat alone in the quiet comfort of my vehicle, watching the digital confirmation of their utter ruin, knowing this was just the very beginning of the long overdue nightmare they had so carefully built for themselves over the years. Richard pulled Patricia roughly by the elbow, dragging her away from the ballroom entrance and into a secluded alcove near the coat check. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the ambient string music, but nothing could muffle the sound of Patricia hyperventilating. Her perfectly manicured hands shook violently as she dug her phone out of her sequined clutch. She bypassed the regular customer service number printed on the back of her declined platinum card and dialed the private concierge line reserved for elite account holders. She tapped her heel against the marble floor, wading through the agonizingly long rings. When the representative finally answered, Patricia did not bother with pleasantries. She launched into a breathless tirade demanding immediate authorization for the $150,000 charge. She explained that she was hosting the most important social event of the season, and any further delay would result in catastrophic embarrassment. The representative, a man whose calm voice only infuriated Patricia further, asked her to verify the account details. Richard paced back and forth, loosening his silk tie, his face flushed red with mounting panic. The representative said, his tone shifting from customer service to something entirely rigid. I am looking at the account now. I cannot authorize this transaction. In fact, I am required to inform you that this account, along with all associated lines of credit, has been frozen. Patricia let out a sharp gasp. Frozen? Do you know who my husband is? Do you know who my son is? Unfreeze it immediately. This is a simple banking glitch. This is not a glitch, Mrs. Wilson, the representative replied. The system has placed a Level 1 federal fraud alert on this entire portfolio. The primary account holder credentials flagged a severe security breach when that massive transaction was attempted. All assets are legally locked pending a federal investigation. Richard stopped pacing. He stared at his wife, the blood completely draining from his face. A Level 1 federal fraud alert meant the government was involved. It meant automatic reporting to federal agencies. Patricia gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. She lost whatever remaining shred of high society decorum she had left. "Listen to me," she screamed into the receiver, completely abandoning her polished country club voice. "You do not understand. There is no fraud. I authorized these accounts. I opened them. I know exactly what social security number is attached to them because it belongs to my own daughter. She is a 27-year-old nobody. She makes peanuts working at some entry-level computer job. She does not use her credit. We just borrowed her number to secure the extra funding for Tyler's wedding. She owes us for raising her. It is not fraud if it is family." Her desperate confession echoed off the marble walls of the alcove. In her absolute panic to force the transaction through and save her golden boy perfect wedding, Patricia had just openly admitted to felony identity theft on a recorded bank line. She thought she was clarifying a misunderstanding. She thought the rules of high finance bent for people in her social tax bracket. She genuinely believed that because she viewed Riley as worthless, the law would view her actions as a harmless family entitlement. She had used my social security number to secretly open millions in credit, assuming I would never have the resources or the intelligence to notice. She assumed I was too poor and too socially inept to ever trigger a credit check of my own. But Patricia did not know that my social security number was not just a regular citizen profile. Down in the parking lot, I sat in the driver's seat of my car listening to the intercepted audio of her frantic phone call through my encrypted dashboard. As the founder of Vanguard Compliance, my personal data was legally tied to high-level corporate security clearances. My credentials were hardwired into the federal monitoring grid. My identity was protected by the exact same cybersecurity protocols used by major financial institutions to catch embezzlers and international syndicates. The moment Patricia tried to swipe $150,000 at a luxury hotel, the system did not just see an overdrawn credit card. It saw an aggressive, unauthorized breach on a federally monitored asset. It automatically snapped the trap shut. Mrs. Wilson, the bank representative, said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "You just confessed to opening unauthorized credit lines using a monitored social security number. I am legally obligated to terminate this call. The fraud alert cannot be lifted by our bank. It is now under the jurisdiction of federal authorities. Have a good evening." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the quiet alcove. Patricia stared at the screen of her phone, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked up at Richard, whose chest was heaving with terrified, shallow breaths. They had funded Tyler's lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the sports cars, and this multi-million-dollar wedding entirely by stealing my identity. They had drained my future to buy his present. And now the absolute certainty of prison time was staring them right in the face. Before Richard could formulate a plan to escape the hotel, the velvet curtains of the alcove were yanked open. Jasmine stood there, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her dark eyes blazing with undisguised fury. She did not look like a blushing bride. She looked like a woman who was about to start an absolute war. The wealthy guests were eagerly taking their seats in the grand ballroom. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, and the massive kitchen doors remained tightly shut. Jasmine glared at Patricia, demanding to know why the wedding planner was threatening to pull the plug on the microphone and send all 300 elite guests home hungry. She demanded answers, completely oblivious to the fact that her perfect marriage was already over. Jasmine's manicured hands dug fiercely into her hips, the massive diamond on her finger catching the dim, moody lighting of the alcove. She did not lower her voice, and she certainly did not care who might be eavesdropping on the other side of the heavy velvet curtains. The polite low murmur of 300 elite guests inside the grand ballroom was rapidly morphing into a restless, irritated buzz. The live string quartet had completely stopped playing their classical arrangements. Waiters were standing awkwardly by the kitchen's swinging doors, with empty hands, nervously avoiding eye contact with the hungry attendees. The illusion of a flawless high society evening was disintegrating by the second, and Jasmine was absolutely livid. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Patricia's chest. Jasmine's perfect, heavily curated public facade was cracking wide open, revealing a terrifying, unyielding rage. She demanded to know exactly why her mother, a highly respected federal judge from Atlanta, was currently sitting at the VIP head table, staring at an empty charger plate. She hissed that her father, a prominent corporate surgeon, had just texted her from inside the ballroom, bluntly asking if the caterers had walked out on the job. This wedding was supposed to be the absolute social event of the year, a flawless merging of two powerful families, and Patricia was turning it into a spectacular, unforgettable public humiliation. Patricia backed up against the dark wood of the coat check counter, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She tried desperately to muster her usual condescending tone, the exact same aristocratic voice she had used to belittle my clothes, my apartment, and my career for the past decade. She attempted to brush off the crisis, claiming it was just a minor administrative delay, a simple, silly miscommunication with the bank regarding their elite daily spending limits. But her voice shook uncontrollably. Her hands trembled at her sides. The wealthy, untouchable mask was entirely gone, replaced by the terrified, wide-eyed stare of a woman actively looking down the barrel of a federal prison sentence for identity theft. Jasmine was not buying a single word of her pathetic excuses. She stepped closer, her custom designer gown rustling loudly and aggressively against the polished marble floor. She threw Patricia's own arrogant bragging right back in her face, like a physical weapon. She viciously reminded my mother of the lavish bridal shower at the country club just weeks prior, where Patricia had loudly boasted to Jasmine's entire extended family about her supposedly limitless offshore accounts and her massive commercial real estate portfolio. Jasmine demanded to know exactly where that limitless wealth was, right now threatening to walk straight back into the grand ballroom, grab the microphone from the silent wedding band, and announced to every single high-profile guest that the groom's parents were completely broke frauds. She promised to cause a scene so catastrophic that Richard and Patricia would never be able to show their faces in polite society ever again. Before Patricia could even attempt to form another desperate, babbling lie, the heavy velvet curtains parted violently. Tyler strode into the alcove. He walked with the arrogant, heavy-footed swagger of a man who firmly believed the entire world revolved exclusively around his desires. He had clearly noticed the lack of food and the whispering guests, but instead of showing genuine concern, he looked deeply annoyed that his perfect evening was being mildly inconvenienced. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom tuxedo, his heavy gold Rolex flashing under the recessed lighting. He took one single look at his pale, profusely sweating parents and his furious bride, and immediately assumed his parents were just being their usual technologically incompetent selves. Tyler slipped his arm around Jasmine's waist, pulling her close in a highly practiced display of masculine reassurance. He kissed her cheek, completely ignoring the absolute terror radiating from my parents' faces. He told Jasmine to calm down, insisting that this was nothing to ruin her expensive makeup over. He looked at Richard with pure, unfiltered disdain, rolling his eyes at the man who had spent 30 years blindly worshipping the ground he walked on. Tyler scoffed loudly, declaring that his parents were clearly just dealing with an embarrassing bank glitch because they simply did not know how to handle modern premium accounts. He was entirely ready to play the ultimate hero, desperate to protect his untouchable golden boy image in front of his new wife and her incredibly wealthy, highly judgmental family. Tyler turned his attention to Cynthia, the wedding planner, who had been standing silently near the edge of the alcove, her wireless payment terminal still clutched tightly in her hands. Tyler confidently reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal corporate black card. He held it casually between his fingers, making absolute sure everyone in the alcove saw the prestigious banking logo. He had bragged about this specific card endlessly. He had told Jasmine's family that his elite investment firm had given him unlimited corporate backing as their top-earning broker. He had utilized the powerful illusion of this card to secure his place in her elite inner circle, projecting an image of absolute untouchable financial supremacy. He handed the heavy metal card to Cynthia with a smug, condescending smirk. Do not worry about my parents and their little administrative issue. He announced, his voice loud enough to carry through the curtains and echo slightly in the hallway. I will cover my own wedding. Put the entire $150,000 balance on this account right now. Let the kitchen staff know they can start serving the main course immediately. I always handle my own business. Jasmine instantly relaxed her rigid posture, softening as she looked up at her new husband with pure, unfiltered adoration. This was the powerful man she thought she had married. A decisive, wealthy provider who could simply wave a heavy piece of metal and instantly fix any crisis. She glared triumphantly at Patricia, clearly thrilled that Tyler was stepping up to publicly humiliate his own parents to save her special night. Richard and Patricia, however, did not look relieved in the slightest. They looked completely paralyzed, physically trapped between the sheer horror of their own federal identity theft and the absolute certainty of what was about to happen next. Cynthia did not offer a polite customer service smile. She simply took the heavy metal card, inserted the gold chip into her portable payment terminal, and waited. The machine hummed quietly, processing the massive request through the wireless network. Tyler crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall, already looking past Cynthia, as if the transaction was an absolute guaranteed success. He was probably already planning his hero's return to the ballroom, eagerly imagining the applause and respect from Jasmine's prominent family when the gourmet food finally arrived. The payment terminal emitted a sharp, harsh, negative beep. The sound cut through the quiet alcove like a physical strike. Cynthia frowned, looking down at the glowing digital screen. She slowly pulled the heavy card out of the machine, her professional demeanor immediately shifting into something much colder and far more rigid. She looked directly into Tyler's eyes. "Declined," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Tyler's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He uncrossed his arms, stammering wildly loudly, demanding that she run the card again. He frantically claimed the machine must be broken aggressively, insisting that it was a premium corporate account with absolutely no spending limit. He desperately reached for his leather wallet, his fingers trembling violently as he pulled out his personal credit cards, his debit cards, everything he had to his name. But I already knew exactly what was happening. While my parents were going down for federal identity theft, Tyler's precious financial empire had just collided directly with the payload I had dropped on his desk right before I walked out. The second domino had officially fallen, and Tyler was suddenly staring into an abyss he absolutely could not buy his way out of. Tyler snatched the heavy metal corporate card back from Cynthia, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped it onto the polished marble floor. He refused to accept reality. He barked at the wedding planner, demanding she reset her payment terminal, insisting the luxury hotel's network was clearly malfunctioning. Jasmine watched him, her initial adoration rapidly curdling into deep suspicion. Tyler shoved the metal card into his tuxedo pocket and ripped his smartphone from his inner jacket. His thumbs hammered aggressively against the glass screen, bypassing his locked home screen to pull up his elite banking application. He intended to show Cynthia his massive available balance and demand an immediate apology for the embarrassment. Instead, the application loaded to a screen that made his heart physically stop. The interface did not display his usual seven-figure portfolio. It did not show the massive corporate credit limits he had constantly bragged about to Jasmine's wealthy family. Every single account line, checking, savings, corporate expense, and private offshore investments displayed exactly $0.00. Tyler stared at the screen, blinking rapidly, convinced his eyes were deceiving him in the dim lighting of the alcove. But the numbers did not change. Spanning the very top of his banking application was a bright, glaring red banner containing 5 words that signaled the absolute destruction of his entire life. Frozen by SEC mandate. The Securities and Exchange Commission had locked him out of his own existence. Jasmine leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening in sheer horror as she read the red text. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into his tuxedo jacket, demanding to know why the federal government had frozen his assets. Tyler yanked his arm away, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. He was suffocating under the weight of his collapsing lies. He needed cash immediately. He needed a massive influx of funds to appease the wedding planner, feed the 300 elite guests, and pacify his furious new wife. His panicked brain desperately searched for any possible lifeline. Then a sudden memory flashed through his racing mind: the white gift envelope, the one Riley had calmly placed in the dead center of that sticky plastic folding table right next to the kitchen trash cans. Tyler had mocked her plain navy dress and her entry-level computer job, assuming she was just a pathetic, socially inept geek. But he also knew Riley was a relentless saver. She never spent money on designer clothes. He suddenly convinced himself that my envelope contained a massive cashier's check, a peace offering from the sister he had bullied his entire life. He assumed I was trying to buy my way back into the family's good graces. It was the perfect immediate solution to his catastrophic cash flow problem. Without offering a single word of explanation to Jasmine or his terrified parents, Tyler turned and bolted. He sprinted out of the velvet-draped alcove, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically against the polished marble floor. He shoved his way through the heavy wooden doors leading back into the harsh fluorescent light of the hotel service hallway. Waiters carrying empty trays jumped out of his path as he barreled toward the designated garbage area. The cheap plastic folding table was still there, wobbling slightly against the industrial wall. And right in the middle, exactly where I had left it, sat the crisp white envelope. Tyler lunged for it, his hands shaking with absolute desperation. He did not care about the optics anymore. The untouchable golden boy, the elite investment broker who only wore custom-tailored suits, was literally tearing into a wedding gift next to a row of massive gray trash cans. He ripped the heavy paper flap open, frantically reaching inside for the check that would save his perfect public image. But there was no check. There was no cash. There was only a thick, folded stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. Tyler yanked the documents out, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The header of the first page bore the imposing, heavily embossed logo of Vanguard Compliance, the notoriously ruthless corporate auditing firm his own investment bank had hired just last month. His firm had brought them in to investigate a series of highly classified internal financial leaks. Tyler smoothed the crinkled paper out on the sticky plastic table, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. It was a formal notice of immediate termination and total asset seizure. The document meticulously detailed every single offshore account, every hidden wire transfer, and every dummy corporation he had used to illegally funnel money away from his wealthy clients. The audit was flawless. The financial trap was completely inescapable. The document explicitly stated that all evidence of his massive embezzlement scheme had already been submitted directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. His knees buckled. He leaned heavily against the wobbly table to stop himself from collapsing onto the service hallway floor. His trembling eyes scrolled down to the very bottom of the final page, searching for the name of the lead auditor who had systematically dismantled his entire life. He expected to see the signature of some faceless elite corporate investigator. Instead, the bold black ink signature staring back at him was entirely familiar. It was my signature. Below the precise, elegant handwriting, the printed title read, "Riley, founder and CEO of Vanguard Compliance." The entry-level computer geek he had just banished to the hallway garbage cans was the absolute authority who had quietly built the auditing firm that now owned his fate. He realized in one blinding, agonizing moment of clarity that I had not been hiding from high society. I had been actively policing it. I had tracked every single stolen dollar he had used to buy Jasmine's diamond ring, his custom tuxedo, and this extravagant ballroom reception. He stared at my signature, the paper shaking violently in his hands, as the devastating truth completely shattered his reality. The heavy legal paper rattled in Tyler's shaking hands as the horrific reality of his situation crystallized in his mind. He stared at Riley's elegant signature, his brain violently rejecting the terrifying information. Vanguard Compliance was not just some random low-level auditing agency. They were the absolute apex predators of the global financial security sector, an elite firm exclusively contracted to hunt down white-collar criminals hiding within the upper echelons of Wall Street. His own investment bank had brought them in exactly 30 days ago to conduct a highly classified sweep for internal data leaks. Tyler had laughed with his arrogant colleagues in the executive boardroom, openly mocking the incoming corporate auditors as glorified hall monitors. He had felt completely untouchable, deeply convinced his complex web of dummy corporations and encrypted offshore accounts was entirely invisible to standard regulatory oversight. He never once suspected that the brilliant, ruthless CEO leading the investigation was the very sister he had tormented, ridiculed and banished to a sticky folding table by the kitchen garbage cans. Riley had not been hiding from the cutthroat world of high finance. She had been commanding it. She had watched him parade around family dinners boasting about his massive commissions, silently holding the keys to his absolute destruction. She had known every detail of his illicit financial maneuvers, while he confidently treated her like a pathetic, awkward failure. The profound irony of his miserable situation hit him like a freight train, completely destroying his massive ego. The termination notice detailed a level of forensic accounting that made Tyler physically nauseous. Paragraph after punishing paragraph outlined the exact methodology he had used to embezzle over $4 million from his firm's most vulnerable high-net-worth clients. Every single stolen cent had been meticulously tracked, categorized, and directly matched to his extravagant personal purchases. The custom Italian sports cars, the luxury penthouse lease downtown, the ridiculous country club memberships, and the massive flawless diamond currently sitting on Jasmine's left ring finger. Riley had documented it all with ruthless precision. He read the digital timestamp printed at the very top of the SEC submission confirmation. 5 o'clock sharp. The exact moment Riley had stood up, smoothed her plain navy dress, and quietly walked out of the venue doors. She had not left because she was ashamed or intimidated by his elite guest list. She had walked out because her job was done. She had pressed the button that transmitted his complete, unredacted financial confession directly to federal prosecutors, just as the string quartet began playing the prelude for his grand entrance. She had deliberately allowed him to stand at the altar smiling and boasting, while heavily armed federal agents were likely already securing warrants to raid his corner office downtown. The undeniable evidence meant he would never see the inside of a trading room again. He was going to federal prison. The meticulously crafted lie of his incredible success had been systematically dismantled by the sister he despised. A visceral, primal sound tore its way up Tyler's throat. It was not a word, but a raw, agonizing scream of pure defeat that echoed harshly off the industrial tile walls of the service hallway. He slammed his fist heavily into the metal siding of the nearest commercial trash can, the violent impact sending a dull, painful shockwave up his arm. He crumpled the Vanguard Compliance audit against his chest, sliding down the wall until he hit the cold floor, gasping desperately for air. The heavy wooden double doors at the end of the corridor suddenly flew open, slamming against the plaster with a deafening crack. Jasmine stormed into the hallway, her massive designer bridal train dragging across the scuffed linoleum. Her face was a terrifying mask of unhinged fury. She had entirely abandoned the pretense of being a poised, elegant bride. She stomped toward him, her heels clicking aggressively, demanding to know what he was doing hiding in the garbage area while 300 elite guests were sitting in a dark, silent ballroom waiting for food. She stood over his cowering form, her hands firmly planted on her hips, her voice echoing with sharp aristocratic outrage as she looked down at him. She shrieked that her wealthy parents were demanding immediate answers and the wedding planner was threatening to leave. The immense social humiliation of the delayed reception was already spreading through the crowd. Jasmine demanded swift financial action, completely unaware that his banking empire had just entirely evaporated. Jasmine glared at the crumpled, sweat-stained legal document clutched tightly in Tyler's trembling hands. She aggressively demanded to know exactly what he was holding, entirely convinced it was some sort of pathetic excuse or a minor banking error notice. Tyler could not even look her in the eyes. The wealthy golden boy facade he had so carefully cultivated for years was completely obliterated. He slowly uncurled his stiff fingers, extending the wrinkled termination letter toward his furious bride. Jasmine immediately snatched the paper from his hand, her dark eyes darting rapidly across the bold black text. He watched the color rapidly drain from her flawless, heavily contoured face as her brain processed the terrifying words, embezzlement, asset seizure, and federal mandate. He watched absolute disgust rapidly replace her bridal glow. She realized she had married a ruined, penniless felon heading straight to federal prison. Tyler swallowed hard, forcing the devastating truth past his trembling lips. He told her, his voice cracking with utter humiliation, that there was no endless corporate expense account. He confessed that he was completely broke, that every single luxury item they owned was purchased with stolen money, and that the federal government was actively seizing his entire portfolio. He admitted that the lavish high society lifestyle he had promised her was an elaborate criminal illusion built on fraud. The silence that followed his confession was absolute, thick with the terrifying realization that their perfect elite marriage had ended before the reception had even truly begun. Jasmine did not scream. She did not cry. The absolute disgust contorting her flawless features was infinitely more devastating than any theatrical outburst. She stared at the man she had just married, her eyes sweeping over his designer tuxedo as if it were crawling with disease. Without uttering a single syllable, she turned on her heel and marched back toward the ballroom, leaving him alone next to the commercial trash cans. Tyler watched his entire future vanish with the swish of her bridal train. Panic, raw and acidic, clawed at his throat. He needed a lifeline. He patted his pockets frantically, realizing his own phone was useless. Riley had blocked his number, his parents' numbers, and every known contact associated with their family. He paced the sticky linoleum, his breath tearing through his lungs until the heavy service doors swung open again. Brent. His best man stumbled into the hallway with a half-empty crystal champagne flute, complaining loudly about the ridiculous delay in the catering service. Tyler did not hesitate. He lunged forward, physically snatching the sleek smartphone right out of Brent's unsuspecting hand. He barked a frantic, disjointed excuse about a dead battery and a critical vendor emergency, completely ignoring his friend's startled protests. Tyler quickly punched in the private digits he had seen on the Vanguard compliance letterhead. His hands shook so violently he dropped the device twice before successfully hitting the green call button. He pressed the phone to his ear, listening to the agonizingly slow rings, praying his sister would answer an unrecognized number. Miles away from the suffocating disaster unfolding at the Waldorf Astoria, I stood barefoot on the heated hardwood floors of my penthouse apartment. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the illuminated city skyline. The chaotic, frantic energy of my past life felt entirely alien up here in the quiet luxury I had earned through relentless, unseen labor. A soft chime echoed from the encrypted military-grade device resting on my marble kitchen island. An unsaved number flashed across the glowing screen. I knew exactly who was calling. I picked up the device, swiped to accept the connection, and held it to my ear without speaking a word. Tyler's voice immediately exploded through the speaker. He was practically sobbing, the arrogant golden boy facade entirely stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate child. He begged me to listen. He babbled incoherently about our childhood, desperately trying to invoke a sibling bond that had never actually existed. When that failed to elicit a response, he shifted to frantic rationalizations. He claimed the missing $4 million was simply a massive misunderstanding. He insisted it was just a temporary corporate loan, a standard accounting maneuver that he fully intended to repay once his annual commissions cleared. He pleaded with me to recall the formal audit, to contact my federal liaisons at the Securities and Exchange Commission and classify the report as a clerical error. He promised to give me anything I wanted, offering to pay me double the auditing fee if I would just erase the digital trail and save him from federal prison. I listened to his pathetic bargaining, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no lingering resentment, no petty sibling rivalry, and no desire for theatrical vengeance. There was only the cold, clinical satisfaction of a closed investigation. My monitoring dashboard blinked silently in the background, confirming that federal agents had already accessed the secured drop file I had provided. Tyler, I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely detached. The SEC does not negotiate clerical errors for embezzlement. The transaction logs are immutable. The money is gone, and so is your career. He let out a strangled, breathless choke, begging me to reconsider, demanding to know how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. I leaned against the cool marble of my kitchen island, looking out at the city lights. You seated me by the trash because you thought I was worthless, I told him, my tone chillingly flat. I am just taking out the trash. I disconnected the call before he could utter another pathetic plea. I tapped the screen 3 times, permanently blocking Brent's number, and set the device face down. The operation was completely finished. Back in the hotel service hallway, Tyler stared blankly at the darkened screen. The dial tone buzzed, signaling the absolute end of his privileged existence. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare. Inside the grand ballroom, the restless tension had finally reached a boiling point. 300 distinguished guests, including city officials, corporate executives, and Atlanta high society, were shifting uncomfortably in their gilded chairs. Cynthia, the wedding planner, had reached her absolute limit. She marched past the empty VIP head table, completely ignoring Patricia and Richard, who were still sitting in stunned, horrified silence. Cynthia bypassed the bewildered string quartet and stepped directly up to the main stage. She signaled the sound technician with a sharp, definitive hand gesture. The ambient background music instantly cut out, plunging the massive room into a heavy, expectant silence. Cynthia grabbed the main microphone from its silver stand. The sharp squeal of feedback echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She did not offer a polite, apologetic smile. She looked out at the sea of wealthy attendees with a rigid, uncompromising expression of professional fury. She tapped the microphone twice, ensuring she had everyone's undivided attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cynthia announced, her voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I regret to inform you that due to severe unresolved issues regarding gross non-payment by the host family, all services for this event have been officially terminated. The kitchen is closed. The bar is closed. This wedding reception is immediately canceled. Please locate your belongings and exit the venue." A collective, deafening gasp ripped through the ballroom. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished floor as 300 elite guests simultaneously stood up in pure shock. The immediate aftermath of Cynthia's announcement was pure, unadulterated pandemonium. Outraged murmurs morphed into shouting matches as Atlanta's most influential socialites demanded explanations. Tyler stumbled out of the service corridor just as the ballroom doors burst open. He looked like a walking corpse, his custom tuxedo suddenly hanging off his frame like a cheap Halloween costume. He took 3 weak steps into the cavernous room before freezing under the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. Jasmine followed mere seconds behind him, practically radiating a lethal, destructive energy. She shoved past a cluster of confused hedge fund managers, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her father, a prominent real estate magnate who had funded precisely half of this disaster, immediately intercepted her. He grabbed her bare shoulder, demanding to know why the catering staff was aggressively packing up the raw bar. Jasmine violently shook off his hand. She did not lower her voice to preserve the dignity of the occasion. She wanted blood. She wanted everyone in that room to know exactly who was to blame for this catastrophic humiliation. She marched directly up to Tyler, her eyes blazing with absolute contempt, and shoved him hard in the chest. Tyler staggered backward, hitting the edge of a silk-draped cocktail table. The remaining chatter in the ballroom instantly died. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the bride and groom. Jasmine unleashed a torrential downpour of vitriol that echoed perfectly across the cavernous space. She called him a fraud, a thief, and a pathetic excuse for a man. She detailed his crimes to the entire room, screaming that his elite Vanguard investment portfolio was entirely non-existent. She announced to his horrified colleagues, his wealthy clients, and her own devastated parents that Tyler had systematically embezzled millions of dollars to fund his fake lifestyle. The word federal prison echoed against the high vaulted ceiling. Tyler raised his hands in a weak defensive posture, begging her to lower her voice, pleading with her to handle this privately. He stammered that they could fix it, that his lawyers would fight the charges, that he still loved her. Jasmine let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sliced through his desperate pleas. Love had absolutely nothing to do with their arrangement. She had married him for the penthouses, the black cards, and the social elevation. She bluntly stated that she would rather die than be associated with a broke felon. Her mother let out a dramatic, breathless sob from the front row, clutching her diamond necklace as the reality of the scandal set in. Tyler looked out at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the very clients whose accounts he had drained. He saw pure, unadulterated hatred staring back at him. The elite investors who had trusted him with their fortunes were already pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their personal attorneys and federal contacts. Jasmine reached up and violently tore the custom lace veil from her immaculate updo. The expensive fabric ripped loudly, taking a handful of diamond hairpins with it. She threw the shredded veil directly at Tyler's feet, a physical manifestation of her disgust. She then reached behind her neck, unhooking the massive diamond pendant he had gifted her that morning, and let it drop onto the polished hardwood floor. It landed with a heavy, hollow thud. She looked Tyler directly in the eyes and delivered the final fatal blow to his shattered ego. She proudly announced to the dead silent room that she was not legally bound to a criminal. The marriage certificate was still sitting unsigned in the bridal suite upstairs. They had planned to sign the document with the officiant after the reception. The legal loophole was her absolute salvation. She declared that there was no marriage, no legal tie, and absolutely zero obligation for her to go down with his sinking ship. She turned her back on him, completely facing her horrified parents. She commanded her family to leave immediately, refusing to spend another second breathing the same air as a destitute criminal. Her father immediately signaled their extended family, wrapping a protective arm around his daughter as they marched toward the grand exit. The bridal party followed suit, abandoning the head table without a single backward glance. The exodus triggered a massive chain reaction. The wealthy clients Tyler had spent years courting, the senior partners at his investment bank, and the local politicians he had heavily bribed, all began scrambling toward the exit doors. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of an active federal investigation. They treated Tyler like a highly contagious disease. Every single bridge he had meticulously built over the past decade was burning to the ground right before his eyes. The elite guests whispered viciously, exchanging horrific rumors and frantic corporate warnings as they rushed past him. They would return to their corner offices and heavily guarded estates and completely erase his name from their directories. He watched the massive wooden doors swing shut behind the last escaping guest. The heavy metallic click echoed loudly. The extravagant floral arrangements wilted slightly under the harsh lighting, mirroring his absolute internal decay. The devastation was entirely absolute. The air grew unbearably stagnant. He had nowhere to hide. He stood completely alone in the center of the massive, rapidly emptying ballroom. The catering staff continued breaking down the tables around him, entirely indifferent to his total ruin. He stared down at the torn lace veil and the discarded diamond necklace resting near his expensive leather shoes. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clinking of silverware being aggressively tossed into plastic bins by the unpaid waitstaff. He had sacrificed everything, betrayed his clients, and destroyed his family for a seat at this table. Now the table was being literally disassembled in front of him. He had absolutely nothing left in his life. He was broken beyond repair. The grand ballroom felt like a massive tomb as the heavy doors slammed shut. Tyler remained frozen in the center of the vast, echoing space, his expensive leather shoes surrounded by the discarded remnants of his shattered wedding. But he was not entirely alone. Hiding in the dim shadows near the champagne fountain were his parents, Richard and Patricia. They had watched their golden son's public execution without offering a single word of defense. They valued their pristine country club reputation far above their own flesh and blood. Patricia frantically wiped a stray tear not out of sorrow for her child, but out of sheer, unadulterated terror that her high society friends would permanently excommunicate them. Richard grabbed her elbow, roughly steering her toward the side exit leading to the valet parking garage. They fully intended to abandon Tyler to the wolves, desperately hoping to distance their own names before the massive scandal hit the morning papers. They muttered harsh, panicked whispers about immediately freezing his access to their joint accounts, agreeing they needed to sever all ties to protect their suburban empire. They never reached the brass handles of the side exit. A sudden violent burst of color shattered the dark ambiance of the ballroom. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light violently strobed through the massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows overlooking the main avenue. The harsh rotating beams painted the elegant damask walls and the crystal chandeliers in stark, alarming colors. The chaotic wail of multiple sirens pierced the thick glass, growing exponentially louder until the deafening sound surrounded the entire hotel. The remaining catering staff froze, dropping silver trays and crystal glasses onto the hardwood floor in sheer panic. Tyler slowly raised his heavy head, the pulsing red light reflecting in his hollow, defeated eyes. He knew exactly what was coming. Riley had promised him federal consequences, and the ruthless CEO of Vanguard Compliance never issued empty threats. The heavy oak double doors of the ballroom did not just swing open. They were shoved violently apart with commanding, aggressive force. A massive wave of dark uniforms flooded the luxurious space. It was a highly coordinated dual-agency breach. Dozens of heavily armed local police officers poured into the room, fanning out quickly to secure every single exit. Directly behind them marched a grim phalanx of federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow acronyms. The sheer scale of the raid was entirely paralyzing. The hotel staff backed away against the walls, raising their hands in silent compliance as the authorities marched onto the dance floor. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a merciless stare, scanned the chaotic wreckage of the reception until his eyes locked directly onto Tyler. However, a squad of local detectives abruptly broke off from the main group, creating a secondary perimeter near the champagne fountain. Richard and Patricia pressed themselves flat against the velvet wallpaper, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. Richard raised a trembling hand, actively attempting to point the incoming authorities toward his ruined son. He loudly declared that they had absolutely nothing to do with Tyler's business dealings, frantically trying to throw his own child under the bus to save his social standing. Patricia nodded aggressively, clutching her designer purse, insisting they were innocent bystanders, completely appalled by their son's criminal behavior. Two local detectives stepped directly into their path, completely ignoring their pathetic, cowardly deflections. The lead detective pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his inner jacket pocket. He did not ask for Tyler. He looked directly into Richard's eyes and demanded he place his hands behind his back. Patricia immediately let out a shrill, indignant gasp, demanding the local officers remove themselves from her presence. She shrieked about calling the police commissioner, loudly citing her extensive charity work and elite neighborhood connections. The lead detective completely ignored her arrogant protests, loudly reading the devastating charges that echoed across the silent ballroom. Richard and Patricia were not being arrested for Tyler's financial crimes. They were being arrested for their own. The detective clearly stated the unbailable charges of aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and grand larceny. He meticulously detailed how they had maliciously stolen Riley's social security number a decade ago. They had used their outcast daughter's pristine credit to fraudulently secure $150,000 in secret loans. They had used Riley's stolen identity to finance their luxury cars, their exclusive golf club memberships, and the initial seed money for Tyler's fake investment portfolio. The sheer hypocrisy of their entire existence was laid bare under the flashing police lights. They had spent years mocking Riley's modest lifestyle while secretly funding their own aristocratic facade with her stolen identity. Patricia screamed in genuine terror as the cold steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, ruining the delicate fabric of her expensive silk sleeves. She thrashed wildly, sobbing about the immense humiliation, begging the officers to take them out through the service elevator so her wealthy friends outside would not see them in chains. Richard simply collapsed inward, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as the heavy metal clicked shut around his trembling wrists. The untouchable patriarch of the family was instantly reduced to a weeping, broken criminal. The local police dragged them both toward the main doors, marching them right past their completely ruined son. Tyler could not even process his parents being roughly hauled away. The federal agents had already formed a tight, inescapable ring around him. The lead agent stepped forward, kicking the shredded remains of Jasmine's bridal veil out of his path. He did not offer any dramatic speeches. He simply read the federal indictment for massive corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. He grabbed Tyler's arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic snap of the handcuffs echoed with terrifying finality. The former golden boy of Wall Street, utterly stripped of his arrogant public facade, was physically hauled away. The agent forcefully marched him directly out the large front doors, where a secure federal transport vehicle waited. The freezing, bitter, biting chill of the harsh night air cut deeply through Tyler's completely ruined, sweat-soaked custom silk tuxedo as the aggressive federal agent firmly shoved him toward the armored SUV. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand entrance of the Waldorf Astoria, transforming the luxury drop-off zone into a chaotic crime scene. Hundreds of elite wedding guests had poured out through the revolving glass doors, clustering tightly on the expansive stone steps, while frantic valets scrambled to retrieve their vehicles. Tyler stumbled against the heavy metal door of the transport van, his wrists screaming in pain against the tight steel cuffs. He twisted his neck, his wild eyes scanning the sea of horrified faces above him. These were not just Jasmine's wealthy relatives, these were his primary investors. The CEOs, the tech founders, and the real estate moguls who had trusted him with their massive retirement portfolios. Desperation completely overrode his remaining shreds of dignity. He locked eyes with Marcus Vance, a famously ruthless billionaire tech developer whose massive retirement account Tyler had personally drained just last week to pay for the ridiculously extravagant floral arrangements currently rotting inside the darkened ballroom. Tyler dug his expensive leather heels into the concrete, resisting the federal agent's firm grip. He screamed Marcus's name, his voice cracking with pure panic, begging for a temporary bridge loan. He frantically promised a massive return on investment, pitching his bail money as a high-yield corporate favor. He pleaded with the surrounding crowd, shouting that Vanguard Compliance had made a catastrophic administrative error, and he just needed a few $100,000 in liquid cash to secure his release and clear his name. The silence from the stone steps was deafening. Marcus Vance stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of absolute revulsion. The billionaire did not reach for his checkbook. He reached for his phone, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, and ordered his legal team to immediately initiate a massive class action lawsuit against Tyler's brokerage firm. The terrifying realization rippled through the crowd of elite investors. Tyler had not just embarrassed himself, he had systematically stolen their wealth. The guests simultaneously turned their backs on the ruined groom in a unified, brutal display of absolute disgust. They pulled their expensive coats tighter against the wind, completely ignoring Tyler's pathetic, sobbing pleas. The federal agent placed a heavy hand on Tyler's head, forcing him downward and violently shoving him into the dark caged interior of the transport vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang, permanently sealing Tyler away from the high society world he had sacrificed his soul to infiltrate. Less than 20 feet away, Parked at the edge of the luxury valet lane, a completely different public execution was taking place. Patricia dug her expensive designer heels into the damp asphalt, aggressively refusing to step inside the back of the local police cruiser. Her custom silk evening gown was hopelessly wrinkled, and her meticulously sprayed blonde hair was rapidly falling out of its expensive diamond clips, but she stubbornly clung to her arrogant high society persona with absolute staggering desperation. She yanked her handcuffed wrists against the arresting officer's grip, her diamond bracelets clinking sharply against the cold steel restraints. She shrilly demanded that the detective release her immediately, loudly proclaiming that this entire embarrassing spectacle was nothing more than a trivial family misunderstanding. She projected her voice across the crowded driveway, desperate to convince her staring country club friends that this was a simple, harmless clerical dispute regarding her ungrateful daughter's credit history. Patricia laughed a high manic sound that bordered on hysterical, waving her bound hands as if shooing away a minor inconvenience. She commanded the detective to call the city's police commissioner, aggressively name-dropping local politicians and threatening to have the entire precinct fired for ruining her son's luxury wedding reception. Richard was already slouched miserably in the back seat of the cruiser, his tear-streaked face buried deep in his trembling hands, completely broken by the reality of their total financial and social ruin. But Patricia refused to surrender her delusion. She lifted her chin, adopting the exact same condescending aristocratic tone she had used for decades to belittle retail workers, waitstaff, and her own estranged daughter. She explicitly informed the arresting officer that wealthy, prominent people did not go to federal jail for merely borrowing a family's social security number to secure a temporary line of credit. The veteran detective did not flinch. He did not care about her zip code, her country club status, or her imaginary political connections. He stepped directly into her personal space, his expression turning to stone under the flashing police lights. He coldly cut through her hysterical, arrogant rambling, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. He explicitly informed Patricia that she was not dealing with a civil dispute or a flexible country club mandate. She was being charged with aggravated identity theft, severe interstate wire fraud, and grand larceny for maliciously stealing $150,000. He leaned in closer, ensuring his next words completely shattered her carefully constructed reality. He stated that federal identity theft carried a mandatory minimum sentence. There were no elite bailouts, no wealthy loopholes, and absolutely no high-priced lawyers who could erase a mandatory federal prison term. The terrifying words hit Patricia like a physical blow to the chest. The arrogant high society smirk instantly vanished from her heavily powdered face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of her immediate future. She finally realized that her stolen country club lifestyle was entirely over-replaced by a concrete cell and a matching jumpsuit. The detective did not offer a shred of sympathy. He placed his hand firmly on top of her ruined blonde hair and forcefully pushed her down into the back of the squad car, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping her in the dark beside her weeping husband. The blinding morning sun offered absolutely zero comfort as it violently pierced through the narrow wire-meshed window of the federal holding facility, casting harsh shadows across the bleak, freezing interrogation room. Tyler, Richard, and Patricia had been unceremoniously dumped into this sterile concrete box, their appearance a staggering testament to their brutal fall from grace. Patricia's custom silk gown was completely ruined, heavily stained with holding cell grime, while her diamond-encrusted updo had collapsed into a chaotic, tangled mess around her pale, unwashed face. Richard sat slumped across from her, shivering uncontrollably in his wrinkled tuxedo pants, having been stripped of his expensive jacket shoelaces and leather belt by the booking officers. Tyler looked practically feral, his bloodshot eyes entirely sunken into his skull after a torturous, sleepless night pacing a tiny cage. The federal agents had temporarily placed the three of them in the exact same secure room to coordinate the massive, overlapping jurisdictions of the local fraud and federal embezzlement cases. It was a highly calculated intimidation tactic designed to let them watch each other completely unravel, and it was working flawlessly. The heavy steel door clicked securely locked behind a departing armed guard, leaving the ruined, exhausted family entirely alone with a single battered telephone resting squarely on the center of the scratched metal table. Patricia immediately lunged forward, her handcuffed wrists scraping against the table. She was still fiercely operating under the desperate, pathetic delusion that her elite social status granted her a magical, immediate escape route from consequences. She frantically dialed Riley's personal cell phone number from memory, aggressively punching the dirty plastic buttons. She loudly declared to her trembling husband and ruined son that Riley was simply throwing a momentary vindictive temper tantrum. She insisted with sheer arrogant desperation that once Riley heard the genuine terror in her own mother's voice, the outcast daughter would instantly withdraw her ridiculous police reports, apologize for the dramatic scene, and post their exorbitant bail. Tyler leaned forward, his chest heaving with panic, begging his mother to put the crucial call on speakerphone. He desperately needed Riley to authorize a massive emergency wire transfer from her Vanguard compliance accounts to cover the catastrophic legal fees currently burying him alive. The line rang 3 agonizing times, each shrill tone amplifying the suffocating, unbearable tension trapped inside the freezing interrogation room. Patricia gripped the plastic receiver with stark white knuckles, aggressively clearing her dry throat to properly prepare her most demanding, authoritative, motherly voice. She fully expected Riley to answer the phone with a hesitant, guilty apology, ready to beg for family forgiveness. Instead, the line connected with a sharp, echoing click, instantly followed by the deep, intimidatingly smooth baritone of a man who clearly commanded absolute authority. The unfamiliar voice immediately identified himself as Harrison Sterling, the ruthless senior litigation partner representing Riley and the entire Vanguard Compliance Executive Board. Patricia blinked in sheer, unadulterated confusion, her arrogant high society facade briefly faltering under the harsh fluorescent lights. She aggressively demanded that Harrison hand the telephone directly to her daughter, shrieking hysterically that this was a highly private family emergency and absolutely no outside corporate counsel was permitted to interfere with their personal affairs. Harrison let out a low, humorless chuckle that sent a terrifying, icy chill straight down Tyler's spine. The elite corporate lawyer coldly informed Patricia that Riley was currently entirely unavailable, as she was presently boarding a private jet heading straight to Zurich to personally oversee a massive European corporate acquisition. He explicitly stated that Riley had permanently revoked all family communication privileges and had legally retained his elite firm to decisively handle the pathetic lingering remnants of their criminal fallout. Richard aggressively snatched the phone from his wife's trembling hands, instantly activating the speakerphone so the entire room could hear the conversation. He adopted his booming, patriarchal tone, barking furiously that Riley had absolutely no legal right to maliciously abandon her own loving parents inside a federal holding facility. He demanded Harrison immediately process a release authorization, loudly insisting that the stolen Social Security funds were simply an informal family loan that they fully intended to repay with interest. He commanded the lawyer to order Riley to drop the absurd identity theft charges immediately before the local media completely destroyed their pristine country club reputation and ruined Tyler's remaining career prospects. Harrison's response was absolute surgical destruction. He did not raise his voice yet, every syllable sliced through the air like a scalpel. He informed the disgraced patriarch that his understanding of the legal system was as fraudulent as his son's portfolio. Harrison dismantled their final delusion with brutal efficiency. He stated with clarity that Riley was no longer driving their prosecution. The exact moment she submitted her meticulously documented evidence of aggravated identity theft and massive corporate embezzlement, the entire situation had instantly escalated far beyond her personal familial control. The Securities and Exchange Commission had officially seized total, uncompromising jurisdiction over Tyler's massive financial crimes. The federal government was now the sole prosecuting entity, And the United States Department of Justice does not casually drop felony indictments simply because a crying, manipulative mother demands a convenient family favor. Harrison detailed exactly how Tyler's reckless actions had triggered an unstoppable, aggressive avalanche of federal audits. A mandatory asset freeze had completely liquidated Richard and Patricia's stolen suburban empire early this morning. Their sprawling manicured estate, their luxury imported vehicles, and their secret offshore bank accounts had already been legally seized by federal authorities to begin frantically compensating Tyler's completely defrauded investors. The lawyer explicitly clarified that Riley could not save them even if she genuinely wanted to, which she absolutely did not. She had officially and permanently washed her hands of their deeply toxic existence. Tyler let out a strangled, breathless gasp, finally realizing that the massive legal wall closing in around him was entirely impenetrable. There were absolutely no hidden loopholes, no secret family favors, and absolutely zero escape routes left. The harsh click of the receiver being slammed down on the other end of the line severed their final connection to the outside world. Harrison Sterling had disconnected, leaving the freezing interrogation room, suffocating under a thick blanket of absolute dread. The federal agent returned mere seconds later, roughly pulling Tyler up by his ruined tuxedo collar and dragging him toward a heavily fortified federal transport bus bound for a maximum security holding center. Patricia screamed for her son, her voice cracking violently as she clawed at the metal table, but the heavy steel door slammed shut completely, cutting off her hysterical cries. Richard slumped forward, his forehead hitting the scratched metal surface with a dull thud. The local detectives immediately marched the disgraced couple back to the booking area to face the grueling reality of their local fraud charges. They spent the next 14 agonizing hours locked inside a filthy, crowded holding cell, completely stripped of their designer clothes and forced into scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuits. The pristine socialites were surrounded by petty thieves and violent offenders, shivering on a cold concrete bench, while the overwhelming stench of bleach and despair assaulted their senses. The absolute humiliation was meant to break them, but Patricia's overwhelming terror slowly morphed into a toxic, burning rage. When their public defender finally arrived, he delivered another crushing blow. The judge had set their bail at an astronomical $500,000 due to the severe flight risk and the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence. With their primary bank accounts permanently frozen and their elite investment portfolios seized by the government, they were entirely destitute. Richard was forced to exhaust his final desperate option. He used his single phone call to contact a notoriously predatory bail bondsman operating out of a rundown strip mall. The sleazy broker demanded exorbitant non-refundable fees and required them to leverage the absolute last shred of unseized equity hidden within their heavily mortgaged suburban estate. Richard signed the predatory high-interest loan documents through the thick security glass, literally signing away the very last asset they legally owned just to escape the concrete cell. The heavy iron gates finally buzzed open late Sunday afternoon. Richard and Patricia stumbled out into the blinding daylight, clutching their belongings in cheap plastic bags. They ordered a discount rideshare vehicle, unable to afford a luxury car service, and sat in deafening silence as the driver navigated toward their upscale neighborhood. The ride home was an agonizing journey into their new horrific reality. As the battered sedan pulled onto their exclusive tree-lined street, Patricia noticed the immediate, devastating consequences of their public arrest. The elite neighborhood gossip network had operated with terrifying efficiency. Their wealthy neighbors' people who had attended their extravagant dinner parties just last week were standing on their manicured lawns, openly pointing and whispering viciously as the cheap car rolled past. A local news van was already parked aggressively across their driveway, the reporter actively broadcasting their spectacular downfall to the entire city. Richard practically dragged Patricia through the side entrance, frantically locking the heavy deadbolts behind them. The sprawling house felt like a massive, echoing tomb. Patricia immediately collapsed onto the velvet sofa, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she opened her laptop. The screen illuminated a string of catastrophic notifications. The prestigious country club board of directors had already issued a formal, merciless email completely revoking their memberships, explicitly citing the severe reputational damage their criminal arrest brought to the elite institution. Patricia's charity committee, her exclusive book club, and her elite neighborhood association had all systematically blocked her from their private groups. She had been instantly and permanently erased from the high society world she had spent 4 decades meticulously clawing her way into. Richard buried his face in a cheap throw pillow, sobbing uncontrollably as the sheer magnitude of their absolute ruin crushed his spirit. But Patricia did not cry. Her immense bruised ego refused to accept an ounce of accountability. The overwhelming evidence, the federal indictments, and the public humiliation did not trigger a moment of genuine remorse. Instead, her toxic, desperate narcissism demanded a scapegoat. She absolutely refused to be remembered as a common thief. Patricia furiously grabbed her expensive smartphone, her manicured fingers flying across the cracked screen with vicious, unadulterated venom. She opened her highly curated Facebook and Instagram profiles, completely ignoring the thousands of mocking comments already flooding her recent posts. She hit the live broadcast button, deliberately leaving her hair disheveled and her makeup smeared to project the ultimate image of a devastated, heartbroken mother. As the viewer count rapidly skyrocketed into the thousands, Patricia unleashed a torrential, fabricated monologue designed to completely rewrite history. She stared directly into the camera lens, letting out a perfectly timed dramatic sob. She viciously accused Riley of being a deeply jealous sociopathic monster who had meticulously orchestrated this entire nightmare out of pure, unhinged spite. Patricia spun a wildly delusional, highly emotional narrative, claiming that Riley had always been dangerously envious of Tyler's massive success and Jasmine's stunning beauty. Patricia aggressively raised her voice, screaming into the microphone that Riley had maliciously hacked into their personal family accounts, deliberately framing her own loving parents for corporate fraud. She cried out to her thousands of viewers, demanding sympathy, insisting that Riley had intentionally timed the fake police raid to violently destroy the most beautiful wedding in Atlanta history. She explicitly detailed how Riley had manipulated federal agents with forged documents, painting her outcast daughter as a criminal mastermind intent on destroying their pristine family legacy. Patricia begged her remaining friends to share the broadcast, pleading for public vindication against her cruel, heartless daughter. She completely ignored the harsh reality of the stolen Social Security number, the massive embezzlement, and the permanently frozen assets. In her incredibly twisted, highly desperate mind, if she screamed the false lie loud enough, the elite high society she desperately worshipped might actually believe her and welcome her back completely. The chaotic live broadcast did not just reach her immediate circle, it exploded. Patricia's hysterical weeping performance was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. She hit every single psychological trigger required to incite mob mentality, manipulating her audience with calculated precision. The algorithm caught the soaring engagement rate, pushing the chaotic video onto the feeds of thousands of local residents, country club acquaintances, and extended relatives. The narrative of a bitterly jealous outcast sister maliciously framing her successful, handsome brother on his wedding day was simply too scandalous to ignore. Within 3 hours, the video had amassed tens of thousands of views. The comment section, initially flooded with mocking jabs about her ruined makeup and federal charges, underwent a massive, rapid transformation. Gullible acquaintances and dramatic family members who thrived on toxic gossip began rallying behind the disgraced matriarch. They aggressively typed out paragraphs of fierce support, completely ignoring the federal indictments in favor of the juicy, melodramatic lie. Patricia's phone pinged continuously with incoming messages of solidarity from women who had just hours earlier voted to banish her from their exclusive social circles. Emboldened by the digital validation, Patricia typed out a massive, unhinged manifesto to accompany the video, explicitly naming Riley as a domestic terrorist who had ruthlessly orchestrated the downfall of their flawless family out of pure, unadulterated spite. The digital mob quickly mobilized, redirecting their collective outrage directly toward the accused mastermind. Riley's private smartphone resting on her sleek glass desk suddenly began vibrating with violent, relentless intensity. The screen lit up with a continuous, brutal stream of hostile notifications. The barrage did not come from anonymous internet trolls. It came directly from her own bloodline. Aunt Susan, who had happily sipped stolen champagne at the ruined reception, sent a massive block of text calling Riley a vindictive sociopathic monster who deserved to rot in hell for sending her own brother to a federal holding cell. Cousin David, a failing real estate agent who constantly begged Tyler for investment tips, left 3 vicious voicemails screaming that Riley had permanently destroyed the family legacy over petty, pathetic jealousy. A prominent family friend whose husband served on the local hospital board alongside Richard sent a strongly worded email threatening to ensure Riley was blacklisted from every major corporate network in the city. They accused her of hacking secure banking servers, forging complex financial documents, and utilizing corporate espionage to ruin a beautiful, innocent marriage. The family group chat a thread Riley had meticulously muted 5 years ago suddenly erupted with hundreds of aggressive notifications. Her extended relatives fed off the massive shared outrage, competing to hurl the most vicious, devastating insults at the daughter they had always conveniently ignored. They demanded she immediately call the authorities, publicly confess to perjury, and drop the charges before they collectively hired a ruthless legal team to destroy her life. Riley did not flinch. She sat perfectly still in her ergonomic leather chair, her sharp eyes scanning the incoming flood of vitriol reflecting off her large desktop monitors. The sleek, silent atmosphere of her corner office stood in stark, magnificent contrast to the chaotic, screaming frenzy unfolding on her screen. A normal person might have shattered under the immense psychological weight of an entire extended family coordinating a massive digital assault. A weaker woman would have immediately drafted a frantic emotional response, desperately trying to explain the reality of the stolen Social Security number and the fraudulent loans. She would have pleaded for them to understand the catastrophic financial damage her parents had inflicted upon her credit score a decade ago. Riley did none of these things. She did not shed a single tear. She did not type out a defensive manifesto. She did not answer the aggressive phone calls. She understood the exact psychological mechanics of a cornered narcissist. Fighting with raw emotion would only feed Patricia's desperate need for dramatic supply. Engaging with the hysterical relatives would only validate their delusional, fabricated reality. Instead, Riley leaned back and took a slow, measured sip of her iced espresso. She watched the unhinged outrage scale higher and higher, observing the digital metrics with the cold, detached precision of a seasoned corporate predator tracking a volatile stock market trend. She wanted the lie to spread. She actively needed Patricia to construct the tallest, most fragile pedestal possible before violently kicking the supporting pillars away. She forwarded every single threatening text message, every unhinged voicemail, and a clear recording of Patricia's defamatory live broadcast directly to Harrison Sterling. The elite corporate lawyer immediately began compiling a massive, airtight defamation lawsuit, meticulously logging every digital footprint her relatives carelessly left behind. Riley knew that absolute silence was the most terrifying weapon she possessed. By entirely refusing to engage, she starved her parents of the dramatic conflict they desperately craved to deflect from their actual crimes. She let the furious relatives exhaust their vocabularies, allowing them to thoroughly dig their own legal graves by putting their vicious threats in writing. The SEC investigation was already moving forward with devastating, unstoppable momentum, completely indifferent to the hysterical opinions of suburban socialites and misinformed cousins. Riley calmly picked up her phone, completely ignoring a fresh string of venomous insults from her uncle, and placed the device face down on the cool glass. She would let Patricia enjoy her temporary, entirely fabricated digital martyrdom. She would let the extended family firmly cement their allegiances to a pair of federal criminals. She simply needed to wait 24 hours for the official, heavily documented federal indictment documents to become entirely public record. The absolute truth was coming, and it carried a catastrophic, undeniable blast radius that no amount of social media crying could ever hope to contain. The silence in her office remained perfectly beautifully unbroken, a pristine fortress of logic built to withstand the impending storm. She slowly smoothed a tiny wrinkle from the soft fabric of her pristine designer skirt, feeling absolutely ready to watch their corrupt empire burn. Exactly 24 hours later, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission officially updated their public press portal. Riley sat at her mahogany desk and watched the refreshing webpage deliver the final execution order. The massive federal indictment against Tyler Vance Preston dropped with a devastatingly clinical headline detailing a multi-million-dollar wire fraud and embezzlement scheme. It was no longer a private family dispute or a hysterical social media rumor. It was now an inescapable, highly documented federal reality. Riley picked up her phone, the glass still cool against her palm, and unlocked the screen. The barrage of hateful text messages from her extended family had continued throughout the night, completely blind to the impending legal apocalypse. Aunt Susan had left another venomous voicemail threatening to cut Riley out of the family will. Cousin David had escalated to demanding a public apology video. They were entirely convinced that Patricia's tearful, unhinged broadcast was the absolute truth. It was time to permanently correct the narrative. Riley opened her private Facebook and Instagram accounts, platforms she rarely utilized beyond bland corporate updates. She did not draft a massive emotional paragraph or record a crying video to plead for sympathy. She operated with the precise, ruthless efficiency of a corporate CEO, neutralizing a hostile takeover. She created a new post and selected a single highly damaging photograph from her camera roll. It was a crisp, high-resolution image taken at the Waldorf Astoria just seconds before she had walked out of the ballroom. The photo clearly displayed her beautifully calligraphed seating card bearing her full name, positioned deliberately on a wobbly cocktail table right next to the swinging metal kitchen doors and a row of overflowing industrial trash cans. It was the ultimate, undeniable visual representation of exactly where her parents believed she belonged in their pristine high society world. She did not stop there. Riley tapped the screen again, attaching a second image to the digital gallery. It was a scanned copy of the official, heavily redacted police report she had filed weeks ago. The black and white document explicitly detailed how Richard and Patricia had maliciously stolen her social security number, systematically forging her signature to secure $150,000 in fraudulent lines of credit. She left the dates visible, proving exactly how long her own parents had been secretly destroying her financial identity to fund their lavish country club lifestyle. The stark legal language of the police report provided a jarring, undeniable contrast to Patricia's hysterical claims of a trivial family misunderstanding. For the final piece of her counterstrike, Riley pasted a direct URL link into the caption box. It routed directly to the freshly published Securities and Exchange Commission press release. The federal document clearly outlined Tyler's elaborate Ponzi scheme, explicitly stating that he had systematically drained the retirement accounts of his elite clients to fund his ridiculously extravagant lifestyle and his luxury wedding. The government mandate laid out the exact dollar amounts, the frozen assets, and the mandatory minimum sentences associated with his massive federal crimes. Riley typed a single brief sentence to accompany the devastating digital package. She simply wrote that the truth did not require an emotional broadcast, only undeniable documentation. She hit publish and placed her phone back onto the glass desk. The digital detonation was instantaneous and completely catastrophic. The algorithm, already highly primed by Patricia's viral meltdown, grabbed Riley's heavily documented post and shoved it directly into the feeds of the exact same local community members who had spent the last day attacking her. The shift in public opinion was a violently rapid whiplash. The wealthy neighbors, the country club socialites, and the extended family members clicked the SEC link and stared at the undeniable federal charges. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Tyler was not a victim of a jealous sister. He was a federal criminal who had literally stolen their money to buy his custom silk tuxedo and rotting floral arrangements. Aunt Susan, who had sent vicious threats just hours earlier, abruptly deleted her hateful comments from Patricia's page. Cousin David frantically attempted to unsend his furious voicemails, suddenly realizing he had publicly defended a man who was currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The elite family friends who had threatened to blacklist Riley from corporate networks instantly pivoted, desperately trying to distance themselves from Richard and Patricia's radioactive social status. Riley's phone began vibrating again, but the tone of the incoming notifications had entirely transformed. The aggressive insults were rapidly replaced by frantic, backpedaling apologies. Relatives who had ignored her existence for decades were suddenly texting long paragraphs claiming they had been maliciously manipulated by Patricia's lies. They begged Riley for forgiveness, frantically insisting they had always known something was fundamentally wrong with Tyler's rapid financial success. Riley ignored every single pathetic apology. She watched the comment section on her own post explode with overwhelming support from the exact same community members who had condemned her yesterday. The undeniable visual proof of the trash can seating arrangement, combined with the stark reality of the police report, completely shattered Patricia's manufactured victimhood. The local gossip network turned its vicious collective attention back toward the disgraced parents. Patricia's unhinged broadcast was now being shared as a spectacular delusional display of maternal manipulation. The entire high society circle realized that Richard and Patricia had not only financed their fraudulent empire using their outcast daughter's identity, but had also attempted to unleash a digital mob to cover up their felony crimes. Riley took a sip of her iced espresso, watching the absolute destruction of her abuser's carefully curated reality. She had permanently destroyed their pristine public image, violently stripping away the last remaining shred of their artificial dignity, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the impending terrifying reality of their mandatory federal prison sentences. The silent war was officially over, and she had won the final battle without ever having to raise her voice once. The digital shockwave from Riley's undeniable evidence hit Patricia's ongoing live stream like a localized nuclear blast. Patricia was still weeping dramatically into her smartphone camera, desperately clutching a soaked designer tissue when the comment feed abruptly reversed its momentum. The sympathetic heart emojis and outraged demands for Riley's arrest instantly vanished, replaced by a brutal, torrential flood of absolute vitriol. Internet sleuths and local community members rapidly cross-referenced the Securities and Exchange Commission link, immediately dropping the devastating screenshots directly into Patricia's chat. The live viewer count skyrocketed past 50,000 as the broadcast transformed from a pathetic pity party into a spectacular public execution. Users relentlessly mocked her ruined diamond updo and smeared mascara ruthlessly, demanding to know exactly how much federal prison time she expected for stealing her own daughter's identity. Patricia's jaw dropped in sheer terror as she watched her carefully constructed digital martyrdom disintegrate in real time. She frantically attempted to delete the hostile comments, her manicured fingers swiping aggressively at the cracked screen, but the incoming volume was entirely insurmountable. The community had completely turned on her. Local business owners publicly tagged the police department demanding Richard and Patricia be investigated for money laundering through their suburban country club accounts. Humiliated and trapped by her own live broadcast, Patricia violently ended the feed, hurling her phone across the velvet sofa. The device bounced onto the hardwood floor, vibrating incessantly as the notification chime became a relentless, torturous alarm of her total social annihilation. She was permanently branded a toxic, manipulative fraud. The exact same extended relatives who had maliciously terrorized Riley mere hours ago were now trapped in a frantic, desperate scramble for social survival. Aunt Susan practically broke her keyboard typing out a massive, groveling public apology on her own Facebook page. She vehemently disavowed Richard and Patricia, explicitly claiming she had been entirely brainwashed by a pair of sociopathic criminals. Susan aggressively blocked her brother Richard's number, terrified that any lingering association with his federal embezzlement case would trigger an audit of her own questionable business finances. Cousin David took his cowardice a step further. He immediately recorded a panicked video apologizing to Riley, sweating profusely as he explicitly labeled Tyler a disgusting parasite who had betrayed their entire bloodline. David violently severed all ties with his aunt and uncle, openly declaring that Richard and Patricia were no longer recognized as family members. The group chat that had served as the primary staging ground for their vicious attack on Riley dissolved into absolute chaos. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins aggressively turned on each other, desperately trying to prove who had suspected Tyler's fraud first. They systematically removed Richard and Patricia from every digital family network, blocking their accounts, deleting their phone numbers, and completely erasing their existence from the family tree. The suburban estate that Richard had fraudulently leveraged was now completely isolated, a silent tomb surrounded by hostile neighbors and a digital mob demanding immediate justice. Patricia sat shivering in her dark living room, finally understanding that she had alienated every single person capable of bailing her out of her impending federal prison sentence. Across town, inside the penthouse suite of the Ritz-Carlton, Jasmine was executing a completely different form of ruthless survival. The stunning, heavily sponsored influencer was currently pacing the hardwood floor in her silk robe, watching her engagement metrics plummet in real time as Tyler's federal indictment circulated the internet. Her elite bridal sponsors were aggressively pulling their lucrative contracts, terrified of being associated with a massive Ponzi scheme. Jasmine did not shed a single tear for her imprisoned groom. She viewed Tyler not as a lost love, but as a catastrophic, highly toxic liability threatening to sink her entire digital empire. She operated with the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned crisis manager. Jasmine strategically positioned her ring light, meticulously adjusting the color temperature to cast a pale, vulnerable glow across her perfectly contoured face. She actively practiced a heartbroken, devastated expression in the mirror, ensuring her eyes looked appropriately moist without ruining her waterproof makeup. She needed to completely sever the infected limb before the federal authorities started looking into her own heavily funded bank accounts. Jasmine pressed the live broadcast button to her 2 million followers, immediately letting out a soft, trembling sigh. She stared directly into the lens, clutching her bare left hand to her chest, explicitly displaying the glaring absence of Tyler's massive, fraudulently purchased diamond engagement ring. The comment section exploded with frantic curiosity as the viewing numbers aggressively climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Jasmine's voice trembled with a perfectly executed, breathy vulnerability as she unleashed the ultimate unforgiving counterstrike against the Vance family. She publicly announced the permanent cancellation of the wedding, explicitly labeling Tyler a disgusting, manipulative con artist who had maliciously targeted her for her massive platform. She stared into the camera and relentlessly dragged his ruined name through the digital mud, claiming she was completely traumatized by his horrific financial abuse. She threw him to the wolves, stating that Tyler had routinely lied about his corporate success, secretly hiding his massive debts behind a facade of fake luxury and rented sports cars. Jasmine dismantled his remaining shreds of dignity, loudly revealing that he had frequently begged her for private loans to cover his extravagant club tabs. She entirely weaponized her massive following, crying out that she was the primary victim of a dangerous federal criminal who had completely weaponized her trust. The digital mob redirected its fury toward the disgraced broker, crowning Jasmine a survivor of a corporate scam. She concluded the broadcast by promoting her new wellness supplements, seamlessly pivoting from heartbreak to monetization with flawless efficiency. Tyler, currently sitting silently inside a cold, heavily fortified maximum security holding cell, was completely oblivious to his ultimate social execution. He was permanently stripped of his wealthy fiancée, his reputation, and his remaining family support. The walls of his federal reality had finally snapped completely shut. Tyler did not remain in maximum security for long, but his temporary freedom came at an agonizing, catastrophic cost. Richard and Patricia desperately liquidated their remaining retirement accounts, cashing out every hidden asset they possessed to secure a predatory bail bondsman. When Tyler finally walked out of the federal detention center, 48 hours later, he was not greeted with a warm family embrace. He emerged wearing the same wrinkled silk tuxedo shirt from the ruined wedding, stepping into the harsh daylight, wearing a bulky monitoring device tightly strapped above his designer loafers. The ride back to the suburban estate was suffocatingly silent. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, completely unable to look at her disgraced son. The illusion of their flawless legacy had completely shattered, leaving behind a toxic, suffocating atmosphere of pure resentment. Tyler immediately reached for his smartphone, desperately hoping to find a single message of support, only to discover his phone service had been permanently disconnected for non-payment. He was entirely severed from the digital world that had once fueled his massive ego. The financial hemorrhage rapidly accelerated the very next morning. Richard drove to his prestigious wealth management firm, desperately hoping to quietly collect his quarterly bonus and formulate a legal defense strategy. His keycard glowed red at the glass security turnstiles. A stern security guard, a man Richard had arrogantly ignored for 15 years, publicly escorted him directly to the Human Resources Department. The termination meeting lasted less than 3 minutes. The firm's senior partners were absolutely terrified of the massive federal investigation bleeding into their own client portfolios. Richard was brutally fired for gross violation of corporate ethics and officially stripped of his unvested stock options. They handed him a single cardboard box containing his personal desk items and explicitly warned him that corporate security would call the local police if he ever stepped foot on the premises again. Richard carried the pathetic cardboard box to his leased vehicle, feeling the crushing weight of absolute ruin. He had spent 3 decades meticulously building a formidable reputation in the financial sector, sacrificing his relationship with his daughter to maintain the appearance of immense wealth. Now, he was permanently blacklisted, a radioactive liability that no legitimate financial institution would ever touch. He was completely unemployable, drowning in federal legal fees and rapidly running out of time. The final pillar of their artificial empire collapsed before Richard even managed to pull into their circular driveway. A brightly colored, unmistakable legal notice was aggressively stapled directly to their custom mahogany front door. The primary mortgage lender, thoroughly spooked by the highly publicized fraud indictments and the frozen corporate assets, had aggressively accelerated the foreclosure process. Richard and Patricia had secretly taken out 3 separate, highly leveraged secondary mortgages against the property just to finance Tyler's absurdly extravagant lifestyle and fund the ruined wedding reception. With Richard officially unemployed and their bank accounts completely frozen by federal investigators, they had absolutely zero capacity to make the monthly payments. The bank demanded immediate evacuation of the premises within 7 days. Patricia collapsed onto the pristine marble foyer, her desperate sobs echoing through the massive empty house. The sprawling suburban estate, the ultimate symbol of their superiority over Riley, was now just another seized asset waiting to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Their luxury vehicles were flagged for immediate repossession. The country club officially terminated their lifetime membership via a cold automated email. They were entirely destitute, facing aggressive federal prosecution, and entirely abandoned by the high society circle they had sacrificed everything to impress. Cornered animals are inherently unpredictable. Patricia, wiping her tear-stained face, abruptly stopped crying and entered a state of pure, unadulterated delusion. She convinced herself that Riley was the sole cause of their absolute destruction. In Patricia's twisted reality, if Riley simply withdrew the police report regarding the stolen identity and handed over whatever meager savings she possessed, they could hire a ruthless defense attorney and fix everything. Richard and Tyler, equally desperate and entirely stripped of their arrogance, eagerly latched onto this deranged logic. They managed to track down a residential address for Riley by digging through an old, discarded piece of junk mail stuffed in the back of a desk drawer. They firmly expected to arrive at a cramped, run-down apartment complex in a dangerous part of the city. They assumed Riley was struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, easily intimidated by their mere presence. The three disgraced family members piled into Richard's vehicle, fully aware that the recovery agents were already actively hunting the car. Tyler sat in the back seat, the bulky monitor rubbing uncomfortably against his leg, muttering venomous threats about making his sister pay for ruining his life. Patricia tightly gripped her designer purse, mentally rehearsing the vicious guilt trip she planned to unleash the second Riley opened her pathetic apartment door. Richard gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, driving them directly toward what they believed would be an easy, forceful extortion. They navigated through the city traffic completely blind to the reality of who Riley had actually become. They were driving straight into the jaws of a predator they had severely underestimated entirely, unprepared for the reality of the destination programmed into their navigation system. The journey took them away from the manicured lawns of their collapsing suburban utopia, directing them steadily toward the glittering, unyielding steel and glass heart of the downtown financial district. Richard stared aggressively at the digital map, absolutely convinced that the navigation system was malfunctioning. There was simply no logical way his outcast, ungrateful daughter resided within one of the most exclusive, hyper-expensive residential zip codes in the entire state. The vehicle finally crawled to a stop outside a magnificent, towering luxury high-rise, guarded by a pair of stern, impeccably dressed concierges. The trio sat in the idling vehicle, staring upward in total suffocating disbelief, completely paralyzed by their own profound ignorance. Richard shoved the gear shift into park, hands trembling against the worn steering wheel. He refused to believe the GPS coordinates. Tyler ripped the rear door open, stumbling onto the pavement while trying to conceal his ankle monitor beneath his wrinkled trousers. Patricia clutched her counterfeit designer bag, her eyes scanning the azure tower. The glass facade reflected the brutal reality of their newly acquired poverty. They marched toward the entrance, their aggressive entitlement temporarily overriding their financial ruin. The moment they breached the sliding doors, a towering security guard stepped directly into their path. His tailored suit and earpiece screamed elite exclusivity. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the corporate authority he no longer possessed, and demanded immediate access to Riley's apartment. The head concierge, a woman with perfectly manicured nails and an iPad, did not even blink. She coldly informed them that residents of the penthouse suites required pre-authorized clearance and their names were absent from the visitor registry. Tyler shoved past his father, threatening the concierge with a phantom lawsuit, his voice cracking with desperate rage. He screamed that they were family, slamming his fist onto the marble desk. Two additional security guards materialized from the shadows, their hands resting ominously on their utility belts. The concierge calmly picked up a telephone, preparing to dial local law enforcement to remove the trespassers. 60 floors above the lobby. Altercation, Riley sat on her leather sofa, watching the pathetic display unfold on her wall-mounted smart tablet. The high-definition security feed offered a clear view of her family's utter degradation. She sipped sparkling water, observing Tyler's red face and Patricia's frantic attempts to pull him back from the guards. A normal daughter might have felt a pang of pity seeing her parents reduced to scavengers begging for entry. Riley felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of finality. She could easily let the guards drag them out into the street, subjecting them to another public humiliation. But allowing them to walk away with their delusions intact was no longer an option. She needed them to see exactly what they had foolishly discarded. She needed them to physically stand inside the undeniable proof of her self-made empire. Riley tapped the intercom button on her screen, her voice echoing smoothly through the lobby speaker system. She instructed the concierge to issue a temporary guest pass and grant them access to the private express elevator. The jarring sound of her calm, authoritative voice immediately silenced Tyler's temper tantrum. The guard stepped aside with military precision, gesturing toward frosted glass doors reserved exclusively for the building's highest tier of residents. The ascent took exactly 45 seconds. The high-speed elevator ascended in agonizing silence, the digital floor counter ticking upward like a countdown to an execution. Patricia smoothed her wrinkled blouse, her mind racing to formulate a manipulative, tearful greeting. The doors slid open with a soft chime, depositing them directly into Riley's private foyer. The overwhelming scale of the penthouse hit them like a physical shockwave. A massive wall of floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Original contemporary art pieces hung against imported stone walls. A sleek glass staircase spiraled upward toward a private rooftop terrace. Everything about the space screamed generational wealth, immense power, and flawless taste. It was a multi-million-dollar fortress built entirely without their money, without their network, and without their approval. Richard's jaw dropped as his eyes calculated the staggering real estate value. The realization crushed the last remaining fragments of his shattered ego. He had spent his entire life mocking her career, unaware that his discarded daughter possessed the exact financial dominance he had just lost his career trying to fake. Tyler stared blankly at the custom infinity pool glowing on the balcony, the blinking red light of his ankle monitor suddenly feeling 1,000 times heavier. Riley stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded authority. She did not offer a greeting. She did not offer them a seat. She simply watched them cross the threshold, letting the deafening silence amplify their discomfort. Patricia broke first. The matriarch, who had spent decades meticulously crafting a facade of country club superiority, collapsed under the weight of her desperation. She did not attempt a calculated manipulative speech. The reality of the impending bank foreclosure and the terrifying specter of federal prison shattered her remaining pride. Patricia dropped to her knees on the imported silk rug. Real agonizing tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup as she reached toward Riley with trembling, desperate hands. She sobbed hysterically, abandoning every ounce of her dignity. Patricia wailed that they were going to lose the house, that Richard was facing indictment, and that Tyler was heading to a maximum security facility, unless Riley paid the massive legal retainers. She was not crying out of maternal love or regret for a lifetime of psychological abuse. She was weeping purely for cash. She begged Riley to write a check, promising to do whatever she wanted, offering to publicly apologize, frantically bargaining her soul for financial salvation. Richard stood paralyzed behind his weeping wife, his face pale and sunken. He could not even summon the courage to look Riley in the eye. The man who had constantly demanded absolute obedience was now emasculated by the sheer magnitude of his daughter's independent success. Tyler remained frozen near the elevator doors, his arrogance extinguished by the terrifying reality of his own actions. Riley looked at her mother kneeling on the floor, observing the pathetic display of absolute submission. The dynamic had permanently shifted. The abusers were now at the mercy of the daughter they had relentlessly terrorized. Riley took a slow, measured step forward, the sharp click of her designer heel echoing through the silent, cavernous penthouse. She looked down at the weeping woman on the floor, her expression devoid of any forgiveness or warmth. Tyler watched his mother grovel and realized tears held no currency in this fortress. He cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his ruined tuxedo shirt, desperately attempting to project the alpha male confidence that had defined his fraudulent existence. He stepped over Patricia, sidestepping his weeping mother, to close the physical distance between himself and his sister. He pasted on a familiar, arrogant smile, the exact smirk he used when stealing Riley's savings to fund his lavish ski trips. He ran a trembling hand through his unwashed hair and adopted a casual professional tone, entirely ignoring the blinking federal tracking device strapped to his ankle. He aggressively pitched a sudden business proposition. He confidently suggested that Riley's compliance firm desperately needed a seasoned financial insider, someone who inherently understood the hidden loopholes of corporate banking. He offered his elite expertise, claiming he could act as a high-level consultant, quietly guiding her corporate strategy while secretly drawing a massive off-the-books salary to avoid federal garnishment. Riley did not immediately respond. She let his absurd proposition hang in the dead silent air of the penthouse. Then a sharp, genuine laugh escaped her lips. The sound was not amused. It was clinical, slicing through Tyler's delusion like a surgical scalpel. She crossed her arms, the custom silk of her blazer catching the afternoon light, and systematically dismantled his entire fabricated identity. She leaned forward, her voice perfectly level, and explicitly detailed exactly what his alleged expertise actually entailed. She listed his catastrophic professional failures, highlighting the pathetic reality that he had never actually closed a legitimate financial deal in his entire miserable career. He had survived exclusively on their father's manipulated contacts and aggressive nepotism. She reminded him that his grand investment strategies were nothing more than poorly disguised Ponzi schemes built on stolen credit card numbers, forged signatures, and rented sports cars used to project fake success. She stared directly into his panicked eyes and delivered the final fatal blow to his corporate fantasy. She informed him that her firm operated at the absolute pinnacle of federal regulatory compliance. They routinely audited Fortune 500 companies. They partnered directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission to hunt down criminals exactly like him. She slowly enunciated every single word, ensuring the harsh reality penetrated his thick skull, stating that a soon-to-be convicted federal felon with an active ankle monitor could not even legally pass the background check to empty the trash cans in her corporate lobby, let alone consult on international financial regulations. Tyler's arrogant smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. His fists clenched tightly at his sides as the utter humiliation washed over his entire body. The terrifying realization that he was entirely useless, utterly unemployable, and permanently barred from the only industry he ever cared about finally broke his fragile spirit. He took a hostile, aggressive step forward, his legendary temper flaring, but the two massive security guards who had escorted them upstairs immediately stepped out from the private elevator alcove, resting their hands heavily on their utility belts. Tyler froze completely, instantly emasculated, shrinking back against the imported stone wall as his corporate delusions burned to ash. Patricia witnessed her son's brutal rejection and immediately shifted her manipulative tactics. She crawled forward on the pristine silk rug, her ruined diamond earrings swinging wildly as she clutched at the hem of Riley's tailored trousers. Riley took a swift, disgusted step back, refusing to let the toxic woman physically taint her clothing. Patricia clasped her hands together in a theatrical prayer, her voice trembling with absolute raw panic. The immediate threat of impending homelessness had completely stripped away the suburban country club matriarch, leaving behind a terrified, grasping shell of a woman. She desperately begged Riley to pay off the bank, explicitly citing the accelerated foreclosure notice currently stapled to their custom mahogany front door. She pleaded for an immediate wire transfer, begging for just enough capital to clear the 3 secondary mortgages and secure a high-powered defense attorney to keep Richard and Tyler out of federal prison. When Riley remained completely impassive, Patricia played her final desperate card. She loudly invoked the sacred bond of family. She cried out that they shared the exact same DNA, that blood was thicker than water, and that a daughter had a fundamental, unbreakable moral obligation to protect her parents from utter ruin. She wailed about the extreme sacrifices she had supposedly made, raising Riley, conveniently omitting the decades of psychological torment, severe gaslighting, and blatant financial theft. Patricia looked up with smeared mascara-stained cheeks, demanding to know how Riley could possibly sleep at night in this multi-million-dollar palace, while her own flesh and blood faced the terrifying prospect of a maximum security sentence and life on the cold city streets. Riley stared down at her mother, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of final closure. She did not feel a single shred of guilt or familial obligation. She calmly walked over to her sleek marble kitchen island, picked up her sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She turned back to the pathetic trio, huddled together in her immaculate living room. She quoted Patricia verbatim, her memory absolutely flawless. She asked her mother if she remembered the previous Thanksgiving, when Patricia had loudly declared to the entire extended family that Riley was just a socially inept geek who would never amount to anything of value. She reminded Richard of the time he explicitly told her that her career was a pathetic joke and that she would inevitably end up begging them for basic financial support. Riley's voice hardened, echoing through the penthouse like a judge's gavel striking wood. She looked directly at Patricia and delivered the ultimate unforgiving rejection. "I am just a socially inept geek, remember?" Riley stated coldly. "You certainly do not want my dirty money." She ordered the guards to throw them onto the street, permanently severing ties. The two massive security guards immediately lunged forward, their thick hands clamping down like iron vices on Richard and Patricia's shoulders. The sudden violent physical contact shattered the remaining illusion of their high society untouchability. Patricia shrieked a high-pitched grating sound that bounced off the imported stone walls, wildly thrashing against the guard's unrelenting grip. Richard grunted, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson as he uselessly attempted to pry the guard's fingers from his tailored collar. Tyler instinctively scrambled backward, pressing his spine hard against the glass elevator doors, desperately trying to avoid the physical confrontation. Riley watched the pathetic struggle for exactly 3 seconds before raising a single manicured hand. The gesture was absolute. The guards instantly froze, holding her parents firmly in place, but halting their forward momentum toward the exit. Patricia gasped for air, her tear-streaked face snapping up toward her daughter. A brief psychotic glimmer of hope illuminated Patricia's eyes. She genuinely believed her theatrical sobbing had successfully manipulated Riley's emotions, assuming this pause signaled a sudden, miraculous financial rescue. Riley slowly lowered her hand, her expression remaining entirely carved from ice. She stepped closer, the sharp click of her heels sounding like a metronome ticking down their final seconds in her world. She explicitly shattered Patricia's fleeting hope. Riley methodically explained that every single time they had maliciously favored Tyler, they were actively digging their own financial graves. She dissected their catastrophic parenting with the ruthless precision of a corporate auditor, dismantling a fraudulent ledger. Riley reminded them of the day they mercilessly drained her college savings account to purchase Tyler a luxury sports car he immediately totaled. She pointed out that their relentless obsessive need to project an image of absolute suburban perfection had completely blinded them to the reality that they were harboring and enabling a parasitic sociopath. Every time they enthusiastically applauded Tyler's fake promotions while actively belittling Riley's legitimate entry-level corporate jobs, they were actively financing their own destruction. They had poured millions of dollars into a black hole of arrogance, entirely ignoring the daughter who possessed the actual financial acumen required to sustain their lavish lifestyle. Richard choked on a desperate, pathetic defense. He aggressively attempted to rewrite history right there on the silk rug, claiming he always knew Riley possessed hidden potential and that his harsh discipline was simply his unique way of pushing her toward ultimate greatness. Riley let out a sharp, genuinely disgusted scoff. She explicitly shut down his delusional revisionist history, coldly stating that his brutal psychological torment was never love. It was just toxic, narcissistic abuse designed to stroke his own fragile ego. She laid bare the undeniable mathematical reality of their situation. The very same ruthlessness Richard had utilized to allegedly prepare her for the corporate world was the exact reason she felt absolutely zero remorse watching his empire collapse into ash. She looked at Tyler, who was currently sweating profusely and desperately avoiding her gaze. She loudly noted the bitter irony that their prized golden son, the one they had sacrificed everything to protect, had not offered a single penny or a single word of legal defense to save them from the federal prosecutors. The sheer accuracy of Riley's verbal execution triggered an instantaneous violent implosion within the disgraced family unit. Trapped in the center of the multi-million-dollar penthouse, the trio suddenly turned their vicious, predatory instincts upon each other. Patricia violently yanked her shoulder away from the guard, turning her tear-smeared face toward her husband. She began hysterically screaming at Richard, blaming his aggressive, fraudulent secondary mortgages for losing their beloved country club estate. Richard immediately snapped back, his voice echoing with raw, unadulterated venom, explicitly blaming Patricia's insatiable pathological need for designer clothes and constant luxury vacations for draining their liquid assets. Tyler, desperate to deflect the incoming crossfire, loudly blamed his parents for heavily pressuring him to maintain an impossible standard of wealth, claiming their toxic expectations forced him to engage in corporate embezzlement just to earn their love. The screaming match devolved into a chaotic, feral display of absolute betrayal. Aunts, uncles, and extended relatives were viciously dragged into the argument as they hurled decades of suppressed resentments at one another. Riley watched the spectacular implosion with supreme detached indifference. Riley turned away from the screaming match and casually walked over to her massive custom-built glass desk. She pressed a single sleek illuminated silver button embedded directly into the desktop, instantly opening a direct, unrecorded communication channel to the building's primary security hub. She issued a single, unbreakable command. She ordered the immediate forceful removal of the 3 hostile trespassers from her property, explicitly instructing the security team to permanently blacklist their names, faces, and license plates from the entire residential block. The 2 guards in the room simultaneously tightened their grips, forcefully dragging Richard and Patricia backward toward the open elevator. A 3rd guard stepped out from the private alcove, aggressively shoving Tyler forward by the back of his ruined tuxedo shirt. The physical eviction instantly silenced their internal bickering. Panic seized them as the realization set in. This was not a negotiation. This was a permanent exile. Patricia desperately clawed at the air, screaming Riley's name in a final agonizing plea for mercy. Richard stumbled, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the polished marble floor as he was hauled backward like common trash. Riley stood perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the edge of her glass desk, dominating the space. She looked directly into Patricia's terrified wide eyes as the elevator doors slowly began to slide shut. Riley's voice sliced through the chaotic sounds of their struggle, delivering her final, undeniable verdict. "I survived because you threw me out," Riley stated, her tone echoing with the absolute power of a self-made titan. "You will fall because you have no one left to steal from." The heavy doors locked shut, finalizing their absolute and permanent suburban destruction. The heavy metallic thud of the elevator engaging its descent mechanism echoed through the penthouse, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Riley stood frozen for only a fraction of a second before turning her back on the empty glass shaft. She walked toward her kitchen island, picking up her sparkling water, entirely discarding the memory of her biological family the exact moment they exited her sightline. The toxic anchor that had dragged her downward for over 3 decades was finally severed permanently, detaching her from their sinking ship. 6 months later, the brutal consequences of that afternoon manifested with unforgiving precision. Tyler awoke to the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a maximum security federal correctional facility. His reality stripped down to a narrow concrete cell and a scratchy wool blanket. The 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, handed down by a no-nonsense federal judge, had instantly evaporated his arrogant smirk. He sat on the edge of his thin mattress, staring blankly at the iron bars, no longer the golden boy of the local country club. The pristine tailored suits and rented luxury cars were replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He had quickly learned that his manipulative charm held zero currency among convicted embezzlers and violent offenders. There were no parental bailouts available within these fortified walls. When he attempted to boast about his fabricated corporate conquests during his first week in the recreation yard, the immediate physical reality check he received from a rival inmate permanently silenced him. Tyler spent his days assigned to the prison laundry detail, scrubbing the dirt of other men entirely stripped of the unearned privilege that had defined his fraudulent existence. He was a nameless number in a federal database, his corporate delusions completely crushed under the weight of actual inescapable accountability. Miles away from Tyler's concrete reality, Richard and Patricia experienced their own customized version of hell. The bank had executed the accelerated foreclosure, with ruthless efficiency seizing the sprawling suburban estate and auctioning off their imported furniture to cover the massive secondary mortgages. They now occupied a cramped, damp two-bedroom apartment located directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat, in a neighborhood they previously would have refused to even drive through. Patricia stood in this galley kitchen, the peeling linoleum floor squeaking beneath her discount department store slippers. She aggressively clipped grocery coupons from the Sunday paper, a humiliating survival tactic she had spent her entire adult life mocking other women for doing. The ruined diamond earrings were gone pawned months ago to pay their initial legal retainers. Her social decimation was absolute and irreversible. When Patricia had desperately attempted to attend a local charity luncheon 3 months prior, hoping to leverage old connections for a loan, she was brutally turned away at the front door. Her former tennis partners and gala co-chairs actively crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her, treating her presence like an infectious disease. The high society she worshipped had aggressively expelled her, leaving her isolated and bitter. Richard sat slumped on a stained secondhand sofa in their cramped living room, staring blankly at a muted television screen. He endlessly scrolled through his phone, desperately refreshing an email inbox that remained completely empty. His once legendary professional reputation was permanently destroyed. When the details of Tyler's federal indictment became public knowledge, exposing Richard's complicity and active enablement of the fraud, his corporate network instantly vanished. Former colleagues refused his calls. Competitors openly laughed at his desperation. He had submitted over 400 resumes for mid-level management positions, only to receive generic rejection letters or deafening silence. The man who had ruthlessly mocked his daughter's legitimate career was now utterly unemployable, blacklisted from the financial sector, and entirely dependent on Patricia's meager earnings from her new part-time job as a cashier at a local discount pharmacy. They spent their evenings in suffocating silence, the toxic resentment they once directed at Riley, now exclusively aimed at each other, their marriage dissolving into a daily bitter war of mutual blame. Meanwhile, Jasmine, the woman who had happily fueled Tyler's lavish delusions, remained completely untouched by the family's catastrophic downfall. She had abandoned Tyler the exact minute the federal agents placed the ankle monitor on his leg, correctly identifying the sinking ship and instantly securing a lifeboat. Sitting at the mahogany bar of a newly opened 5-star restaurant downtown, Jasmine casually swirled a customized martini. She wore a stunning backless designer dress, her eyes expertly scanning the VIP lounge for her next financial host. She locked eyes with an older, significantly wealthy tech executive across the room, flashing a practiced predatory smile. She elegantly crossed her legs, adjusting her posture to ensure maximum visibility, already calculating the exact value of his imported platinum watch. Tyler's impending 5-year prison sentence was not even a footnote in her memory. He was simply a dried-up ATM she had discarded on her relentless climb up the socio-economic ladder. High above the grinding reality of the city streets, Riley stepped out onto the expansive wraparound balcony of her multi-million-dollar penthouse. The crisp evening wind whipped through her hair as she leaned against the reinforced glass railing, surveying the glittering, illuminated skyline that stretched endlessly before her. The chaotic, screaming panic of her biological family was entirely absent from her atmosphere. Her phone chimed softly from the teak patio table. She picked it up, her eyes scanning a newly arrived email from her chief financial officer. The subject line highlighted the finalized quarterly reports. Her compliance firm had just secured 3 massive international contracts, pushing their quarterly profits into unprecedented record-breaking territory. The numbers on the screen represented absolute, undeniable triumph, built entirely on her own intellect, tireless dedication, and unwavering ethical standards. She had not relied on nepotism, stolen credit, or manipulative charm. Every single cent was earned through legitimate, grinding hard work. Riley calmly closed the email application, locking the phone and setting it face down. She picked up a crystal glass filled with imported red wine, the deep ruby liquid catching the reflection of the city lights. She took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich flavor settle on her palate. A genuine, relaxed smile finally broke across her face, reaching her eyes. The lifelong scapegoat had systematically dismantled the false idols of her past and emerged as the undisputed queen of her own empire. There were no more manipulative phone calls to screen, no more backhanded compliments to decode, and absolutely zero unearned guilt to carry. The paralyzing noise of their endless demands had been permanently muted. Riley looked out over the sprawling metropolis she had conquered, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the cool night air. The silence of a truly toxic free life was not just peaceful. It was a profound, hard-won victory. She had finally claimed the brilliant, unshakable future she always deserved, and it was absolutely beautiful. Riley's story powerfully illustrates that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior. The profound lesson here is that establishing absolute boundaries is sometimes the only path to genuine peace. When family members constantly diminish your worth and manipulate your resources, true love for yourself requires severing those destructive connections. Her ultimate triumph was not just financial. It was her refusal to remain a scapegoat. As an I observe that walking away from chronic abuse is not a failure, but a courageous victory. Share your own personal experiences with setting strict boundaries and please comment below today.